You think you know the story. You've been fed a fairy tale, a magnificent sultan, so besotted with a slave girl that he shattered 500 years of tradition to make her his wife. But you're not here for fairy tales. You are here to learn what really happened on Hurrem Sultan's wedding night that changed the Ottoman Empire. They call it the wedding of the century. I call it the scene of a crime. Because what happened on these sheets on that night in 1534 wasn't love. It was a transaction. It was the consummation of a political assassination. The victim wasn't a person, not yet. The victim was an entire empire. That night, a man didn't take a wife. A parasite took a host, and in the stench of perfume and sweat, under the glittering dome of the Topkapi Palace, the Ottoman Empire was spiritually and politically violated. The first cancerous cell of its eventual agonizing death was implanted. Forget the romance. Forget the grand spectacle. What really happened on Hurrem Sultan's wedding night was the meticulous, ritualistic sacrifice of a world power on the altar of one woman's ambition and one man's pathetic weakness. They sold you a love story to cover up the filth, but we're going to peel back the silk sheets and show you the rot underneath. This disgusting act wasn't the work of one monster. It was the symptom of a disease that had infected an entire system. So how did they build this perfect machine of depravity? The answer is even filthier than you can imagine. So, let's meet the architects of this grand decay. Let's drag them out of the perfumed mists of history and see them for the monsters they truly were. First, the man they call the Magnificent, Sultan Suleiman, the lawgiver, the shadow of God on earth. What a pathetic fraud. History paints him as a titan, a brilliant statesman and warrior. The reality? He was a hollow man. A man so utterly consumed by his obsession with one woman that he set a torch to his own legacy. He wasn't magnificent. He was a fool led by his groin, a puppet whose strings were pulled from inside the gilded cage of his own harem. Every decision, every law, every execution that followed his so-called love for Hurrem was a testament not to his strength, but to his utter, catastrophic weakness. He saw a goddess in a slave, but he was blind to the jackals smiling back at him, ready to devour everything he held dear. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he willingly became a slave himself. And then, there's her. The star of our little horror story, Alexandra Lisovska, Roxolana, Hurrem Sultan, the laughing one. Don't let the name fool you. Her laughter wasn't the sound of joy. It was the sound of contempt. Contempt for the empire she infiltrated, for the rules she gleefully shattered, and for the slobbering idiot sultan who gave her the keys to the kingdom. They tell you she was a survivor, a victim who fought her way to the top. What a sanitized lie. She wasn't a survivor. She was a predator of unparalleled genius. She didn't just adapt to the snake pit of the harem. She became the apex predator. She weaponized her body, her mind, and her womb to orchestrate a coup d'etat so subtle, so insidious, that its true nature has been buried under centuries of romantic garbage. She saw the levers of power, and she realized they were all connected to the Sultan's bedchamber. But a few jackals acting in the shadows is one thing. What happens when they turn their personal sickness into the law of the land? What happens when the entire mechanism of power exists only to feed their perverse desires? That's where the real nightmare begins. How did they get away with it? They built a machine. Or rather, they took a pre-existing machine and twisted it into an engine of personal vengeance and ambition. That machine was the imperial harem. You have this image in your head, don't you? A paradise of beautiful, languid women, draped in silk, waiting to please the Sultan. It's a fantasy designed to mask a disgusting reality. The harem wasn't a pleasure palace. It was a human abattoir. It was a gladiator school where the only weapons were poison, whispers, and the calculated deployment of sex. It was a place where hundreds of women, stolen from their homes, were pitted against each other in a brutal, never-ending death match for proximity to power. Survival meant utter ruthlessness. It meant crushing your rivals, turning their friends against them, and, if necessary, ensuring their children never drew breath. This was the vile ecosystem that created a monster like Hurrem. But she didn't just survive it. She perfected it. She took this engine of paranoia and turned it into her personal intelligence agency and secret police. The eunuchs who guarded the doors became her spies. The serving girls who brought the sherbet became her informants. The bath attendants who scrubbed the skin of her rivals became her agents of influence. Every whisper in the marble halls, every secret shared between terrified concubines, every shred of gossip made its way back to her. She transformed the harem from a mere breeding pen for the dynasty into the shadow government of the Ottoman Empire, with herself as its spy master, its treasurer, and its executioner. Suleiman, the magnificent fool, was completely oblivious. He thought he was the master of this domain. In reality, he was its most pampered prisoner, completely insulated from the truth, fed a carefully curated diet of lies and manipulations by the woman who shared his bed. They had built a perfect, self-sustaining engine of filth. But every machine, when pushed to its limit, either breaks down or explodes. And an explosion was coming, an event so vile it would make everything before it look like child's play. This was the day the mask finally came off. The day the whispers and the poison gave way to cold, hard steel. The great machine of the harem, now fully controlled by Hurrem, had one final glaring obstacle in its path: Şehzade Mustafa. He was Suleiman's firstborn son, his heir, born to Hurrem's rival, Mahidevran Sultan. And he was everything Hurrem's own sons were not. Mustafa was brilliant, charismatic, a beloved warrior celebrated by the Janissaries, the elite fighting force of the empire. He was the future. He was the embodiment of everything the Ottoman dynasty was supposed to be. And so, he had to die. For years, Hurrem's engine of corruption worked tirelessly on this single objective. It dripped poison into Suleiman's ear, not from a vial, but in the form of letters, forged documents, and paid-off informants. The whispers were always the same. Mustafa is plotting against you. The army loves him more than you. He wants your throne. He wants you dead. It was a campaign of psychological warfare waged against a father by his wife, using his own son as the target. Suleiman, his mind softened by obsession and his judgment clouded by Hurrem's venom, started to believe it. He saw his brilliant son not as his legacy, but as his rival. The decision to eliminate Mustafa was the true point of no return. It was the moment Suleiman agreed to murder the future of his own empire to secure the power of the woman who had bewitched him. The wedding, their official public union, was not just a celebration of their love. It was the public ratification of this demonic pact. It was Hurrem's ultimate victory, the formalization of her control. It was a signal to the entire world that the old rules were dead. The harem slave was now the empress, and her will was law. They had crossed the line. The pact with the devil was signed in blood. But all of this was just a rehearsal for their final masterpiece of cruelty. What they did next wasn't just a crime. It was an abomination against the very idea of a state. Now we return to that bed, to that wedding night. Forget the music and the fireworks outside. Forget the feasting and the public celebrations. That was all a lie. A carefully constructed piece of theater for the masses. The real event took place in the suffocating silence of the imperial bedchamber. Plunge into that room with me. Smell the cloying incense desperately trying to mask the stench of conspiracy. See the flicker of the oil lamps on the gold-threaded silks, a glittering facade over a pit of moral decay. This was not a night of passion. It was a ritual. It was a black mass celebrating the death of tradition. When Suleiman took Hurrem as his legal wife that night, he wasn't just breaking a rule. He was committing an act of profound sacrilege against his own lineage. For centuries, sultans did not marry their concubines. They took them, bred with them, and kept them as property. This was the cold, brutal logic of the empire, The Sultan belonged to the state, not to a woman. His seed was for the dynasty, not for love. By marrying Hurrem, Suleiman declared to the heavens and the earth that this was no longer true. He was hers. The state was secondary. The dynasty was secondary. The future of the world's most powerful empire was now subject to the whims and ambitions of a single woman from a Ruthenian village. Every touch was a seal on a death warrant. The death warrant of Mahidevran, who would be exiled and impoverished. The death warrant of Mustafa, who would soon be strangled by his own father's deaf mutes. The death warrant of the meritocratic system that had made the empire great. This was their Vulture's feast. The two of them, alone in that room, feasting on the carcass of the future. They weren't making love. They were carving up an empire. It was the quietest, most devastating coup in history, executed not with armies in the field, but with vows whispered in a bedroom. And when the carnage was over, a terrible silence fell. But in that silence, a new horror was born. The lie. The desperate, pathetic attempt to bury the bodies and rewrite the story as a romance. But you cannot bury the truth. And the truth that crawled out of that gilded bed was even more monstrous than the conspiracy itself. Every monster fears the dawn. But for these two, there was no dawn of judgment. There was no reckoning. They won. They got everything they wanted. The machine they built worked perfectly. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent during a campaign. As the prince entered, expecting to greet his father, he was set upon by assassins. He was strangled to death, looking into the eyes of the father who had condemned him based on the lies of his stepmother. The empire's brightest star was snuffed out. And what was the result of this grand love story? After Suleiman's death, the throne passed to Hurrem's son, Selim II. History knows him as Selim the Sot, an incompetent, drunken degenerate who spent his reign in the harem, a pale imitation of his father's greatness. He was the first of a long line of weak, palace-bound sultans, puppets of their mothers and wives. The era Hurrem inaugurated is known as the Sultanate of Women, and it was the beginning of the end. The rot that began in Suleiman's bed spread through the entire body of the state, hollowing it out from the inside for the next 300 years. There was no justice. Hurrem died a beloved empress. Suleiman died hailed as the Magnificent. Their crimes were washed away, repackaged, and sold to you as a triumph of love. This is the ultimate depravity. Not just the crime itself, but the successful campaign to call it a virtue. In the end, their empire of filth didn't so much crumble as it slowly decayed, consumed by the cancer they planted. But their legacy? Their legacy is a poison that still seeps into the ground we walk on today. They taught the world a lesson, not about love, but about how an entire system, an entire civilization, can be brought to its knees by the private obsessions of the powerful. They proved that the bedchamber can be a more devastating battlefield than any field of war. And if you think their time is over, if you think we've learned anything at all about the corrupting influence of absolute power and personal desire, you haven't been paying attention.